session, then we're ready to go.
Hello and welcome to the Clark Hill webinar on privacy enhancing technologies. My name is Myriah Jaworski, and I am a data privacy partner at Clark Hill in its California and New York offices. Clark Hill is an international law firm with offices throughout the United States, Ireland, and Mexico, where our term services global businesses in data privacy, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence compliance. We have a very esteemed panel joining us today to discuss pets. First, we have Dr. Divya Sridhar, who is the Vice President of the Global Privacy Division and Privacy Initiatives Operations at the BBB National Programs. There, she oversees the design, development, and launch of multiple industry self-regulation programs, including the Digital Advertising Accountability Program. Dr. Sridhar has written books and authored publications in the fields of tech, privacy, and public policy. We also have Dr. Gary Howarth joining us today. He is a physical scientist for the Privacy Engineering Program and Public Safety Communications Research Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. In that role, Gary develops and implements programs designed to inform practical implementations of technology. Gary is one of the editors of the recently issued NIST guidelines for evaluating differential privacy guarantees, and he has a particular interest in the adoption of pets. So thank you both for joining us today. We have a very full agenda. First, we're going to dive into an overview of pet technologies, what they are and how they work. Then we'll move into a discussion of pet adoption and identify specific use cases for pets, including for international data transfers and in the ad tech space with the phase out of third-party cookies in Chrome. Last, we'll talk about emerging standards and other ways to evaluate pet effectiveness. But before we jump into pet technologies, let's talk about the landscape within which pets have emerged. Next slide. So privacy is in the news every day now. From an increase in the frequency of cyber attacks and security incidents, which can lead to the exposure of personal data held by an organization, to the uptick in consumer class action litigation, where individuals allege that a business has improperly used their data, to now operating in an environment where we have 14 enacted state privacy laws and regulation, federal privacy laws, and international privacy regimes, to industry pressures that we see in the online space, with larger platforms like Apple and Google requiring certain privacy controls be in place. And then, of course, there's just increasing consumer awareness and desire for privacy and trust. The privacy landscape is a challenging one, even for businesses that devote meaningful resources and have dedicated staff. Businesses are often looking for ways to mitigate privacy risks. But at the same time, we don't want to lose the value of our data. Businesses need access to relevant data to help them dive into intelligence-led decisions. We want to be able to share our data with third parties in order to have them perform certain services for us. Maybe we want to enhance our first-party data with third-party data repositories to gain additional insights. There are many positive business outcomes from being able to effectively use and leverage data. Depending on our sector, some of that data is even going to be regulated as personal information or potentially sensitive personal information. Think about healthcare and the financial sectors. But even now, under state privacy laws, even certain types of demographic information and geo-tracking location data is now sensitive personal information subject to heightened restrictions. As compliance counselors, we're always working with businesses on their APTs, their administrative, physical, and technical controls that are the foundation to a robust data privacy program. Pets are a prime example of a technical control that can be leveraged as one part of a larger compliance strategy. Next slide. So in general, pets are a family of technologies: homomorphic encryption, anonymization, differential privacy, and synthetic data. Gary is going to walk us through different types of pets. But in general, they operate to enhance user privacy and/or to remove personal identifiers, while also maintaining the value of data, right? That data utility element is a really important one for businesses. Some pets are themselves data protection principles like anonymization under the GDPR. while other pets can just help to achieve data use that's otherwise consistent with data protection principles. Pets can aid in regulatory compliance by removing those identifiers that take data out of scope, and by helping to better safeguard user data, which also works to enhance user and consumer trust. As we'll talk about on another slide, regulators are well aware of the opportunities presented by the use of pets and are encouraging their use and adoption with certain considerations in mind. And as we'll talk about, pets do this in different ways, depending on their functionalities, and they can be used in different contexts. So part of the business approach to pet adoption is going to be privacy risk prioritization, tasking and working with our internal teams to understand those privacy risks that are most capable of reduction through pets, and then evaluating the common pets and the commercially available pets for purposes of implementation. So with that overview, I'm going to turn it over to Gary to walk us through some of the sort of pet functionalities.
Great, thanks very much, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So what I hope to accomplish is to give a little landscape analysis of some of the current technologies that are available that we consider as pets, and sort of how they should fit into a larger program within an organization. So I hope to touch on topics on like how does, where does pets, where are they situated within the larger data life cycle, and what sort of considerations you have when you're considering adopting pets. So the first thing that's really critical to recognize is that privacy enhancing technologies are just one piece of the puzzle that need to fit within a larger consideration within any data collection program. And so pets are really one of the last steps that a program is going to need to consider. And all of the choices within a data program need to go back and think about what are you actually trying to accomplish within your organization? What are your goals for your data? How are you going to use them? How are you going to, what do you plan to share and why? And those big key questions are going to help inform all of the other processes. Building privacy, isn't something you do after the fact. I think more and more we recognize that we build privacy into our programs as a design standpoint. So the first thing we have to think about is what information are we collecting? Is it strictly necessary? Is it reasonable and ethical? Is it going to help further our goals? Is it going to open up risks if we're collecting a bunch of data that may just be extraneous to our program? I think that most organizations are now cautious of just hoovering up all the data that they could possibly get their hands on because there are certain risks with that. Once you actually have the data, you've got to think, how are you protecting those data? What systems are you using to make sure that attackers, both outside and insiders, can't access those data in an unauthorized fashion? What's the lifetime of those storage practices? How are you making policies within your organization? Finally, once you have these data, how are you going to use them? And how are you going to share them? And that's where the pets piece comes in, is you want to take some original data and then make it useful to your partners or to other teams without necessarily giving all of the data. And so pets are a way then of being able to try and harvest the utility of the data while also limiting the risk to privacy. If we could go to the next slide. So sort of a first thing to think about is before you actually implement pets, how are you protecting your data? And encryption is one of those key pieces of that puzzle. And so there's lots of different tools out there that's protecting the data that you've already collected. So you can think of these as sort of the building blocks on which you are going to secure the data and then deploy your pets. There's a couple new technologies out there, such as homomorphic encryption, which are being touted as a potential way of protecting privacy, but it should be thought about in a larger context about what are you trying to accomplish. Homomorphic encryption is a way of making running algorithms on encrypted data. So this is a great way of storing data in the cloud and then running computations in the cloud and being able to get back some data that the entire pipeline is encrypted. So it means that your cloud provider would never actually see the data or have access to it. But this isn't necessarily a pet in any traditional sense of the word, because it doesn't really improve necessarily the utility or the shareability of your data, but rather it should be another piece of the puzzle on how to protect it from partners that you might not think of as data partners, such as cloud service providers. If we go on to the next slide, then let's talk about some sort of the basic pets that we often think about. The first types of tools that we could use to potentially share data. Anonymization and redaction get a lot of attention because they're these legacy tools that we've been using. Many programs use them successfully to some extent, and they're popular because they're very easy to sort of conceive and understand. They have a very intuitive grasp of how this could potentially protect privacy. Of course, if you want to share data with your partners, you don't want to expose privacy. You don't want to share the names, social security numbers, or other sorts of personal information. And there's lots of different techniques for this. Lots of organizations use it. The US Census Bureau, until recently, has relied essentially on these types of technologies and these techniques for protecting data privacy. But there's some really important things to observe about this. One is that redaction technologies are informal, that they have an intuitive sense, but it's very difficult to actually guarantee the privacy of these. And it turns out that there's also some potentially severe consequences to the utility of the data. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean in a little bit. If we go on to the next slide, let's look at some other, this is how a data redaction program might actually affect your privacy and utility. So let's say that you have a donor list that you want to share, you want to publish, what sort of diverse individuals share their wealth with an organization, but you obviously don't want to expose their information. The first thing you do, of course, is redact their name. And then it's important maybe to go through and find individuals that look like they are unique, that could be singled out. So you might want to reduce someone that's exceptionally old, or someone who looks like they're an unusual person from a small town. But one of the things that we see when we start redacting data is that it really starts to change both the aggregate numbers, and then also it still doesn't guarantee the privacy of the individuals in those records. It's still possible to relink it. I'll actually give you some specific examples in a little bit. But I just want to point out this fact that masking redaction, it seems like a good idea, but it might actually not be very important to preserving privacy, and it might affect your utility. So something to really reconsider now that we have some alternative tools. So let's actually talk about what some of those alternative tools are on the next slide. Brilliant. So one potential tool is pseudo-anonymization. This is getting some traction because it's called out specifically in GDPR, the European privacy law, and in which you take the tokens or the names or whatever feature that you have in your data, and then you rename them. So if you click forward, I bet there'll be like a little, it'll show you what this could look like. So in a very simple sense, is it going to show up? Maybe hit forward, and I think you'll have there. Thank you. So you can put a pseudonym for all the names. This could be helpful for essentially for reducing the risk of easily identifying a person, but it doesn't necessarily protect against many different types of attacks. Again, that singling out attack I mentioned earlier is still present for this scheme of pseudo-anonymization. So some people may say, oh, it no longer links back to an individual, but you can still single out the oldest person in New York City from this data, or some other person with an unusual trait. So pseudo-anonymization is a technique that needs to be done a little cautiously. So one other way that people have been thinking about this is that, oh, you need to pseudo-anonymize many different features, as many features as you can really, which could potentially limit the utility of the data, obviously. So one further step one might do, instead of just pseudonymizing the names of this data, is you might also bin the ages so that you have ranges for those ages, or maybe ranges for the income, to provide a little bit more coverage for the actual pseudo-anonymization that you're doing. Again, it's important to note that pseudo-anonymization tends to perform, that it provides informal privacy that that attacker might be able to break. It's difficult to understand what the consequences are of pseudo-anonymization. And the next slide, let's talk about why attackers might be able to break these schemes, pseudo-anonymization and redaction. One of these is these linkage attacks become very popular amongst hackers. And this is where you have some sort of redacted record, and then you use an auxiliary data set to try and relink those. So if you, for example, release some medical records, you want to take out names, social security, maybe birth date, just leave some of the key things that would help researchers figure out maybe the outcomes of various treatments. However, we've been able to show that using other public sources of information, you can link these. So if you go to the next slide, I think we'll show how we can link, for example, a redacted medical record with public voter roster information. And that just using sex, birth, year, and zip code identifies almost 90% of Americans uniquely. So it's actually really easy to perform linkage attacks when you have a few of these things that are we sometimes call quasi-identifiers, which are these demographic traits that are unique to a person, that are sort of immutable. So things like sex, ethnicity, birth, year, zip code, all those sorts of things that don't change about you over life, is that there's lots of third-party data sources that hackers can then link. So this is a huge risk that informal types of privacy don't actually deal with. So the alternative to informal privacy is formal privacy. If you go to the next slide, and what formal privacy means is when you use some sort of rigorous mathematical definition for privacy, like differential privacy. This is becoming a huge area of research, and lots of organizations are now deploying this differential privacy in their programs. US Census Bureau, Apple, Google, all use differential privacy in their either their collection programs or in their release programs. So just a couple of things. I'm not going to dive into the definitions of differential privacy, but I just want to point out a couple important pieces. Is that differential privacy is a definition of privacy that's rooted in a mathematical comparing mathematically output and input data sets. It's this framework for adding noise to create privacy, and it quantifies how much a single record can contribute to some output data. But it's important to recognize that differential privacy is not a single algorithm. It's that there's many different ways of accomplishing differential privacy. Some are much better than others, and that it's not an approach that is appropriate for all data all the time. It's not going to solve all of your problems. I'll show you how noise can create privacy and sort of give you an idea of what differential privacy is trying to accomplish on the next slide. So many technology companies are using differential privacy when they collect data. So for example, my phone, it makes suggestions when I text to suggest what emojis I might want to use. And the phone sends back feedback to the tech provider on what I select. So it's giving feedback on how good their predictions are, essentially. So some companies are now adding noise into that collection process. So when I text, every time I say sleep, I actually choose a little bed icon. I don't do anything else. If you hit the next slide, please. So Gary always chooses bed to represent sleep. So every time I do that with my phone, it should go sleep, 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 sleep. And if it always sent it back to Apple correctly, it would always say sleep. But periodically, my phone will flip the signal, will actually change what I select and put in something else. It adds in some noisy feedback to the data, to the tech company. So sometimes when I hit bed, it actually hits the Z or, the sleepy face emoji. And Apple doesn't know which of these are noise and which one I actually selected. So in this way, it creates plausible deniability. So they don't actually know what I'm selecting when I do this. If you hit the next slide. And so this is a simplistic way of representing it. I'm not actually trying to represent this as precisely how Apple collects this, but this is the general scheme that lots of organizations are now using, is they inject noise to essentially add plausible deniability. And the next slide. I think this is a duplicate. Can we keep on going, please? Yeah, yep, still a duplicate. Brilliant, thanks. So that's one model where you add noise when the user gives you the data. Another model is that you collect the data, all the real data, and then you can put it through what we call a synthetic data generator, where you add privacy parameters like noise and other things in a differential privacy algorithm, and you can output synthetic data. So this is another type of scheme that can provide some privacy. It's important to recognize, though, that the ground truth data your organization still has, so you still have to protect that. If it gets leaked or hacked, then it provides no privacy. And then synthetic data, you can release those potentially to your partners, but there are some potential risks to that as well. You have to actually know, are those data useful? Are they actually private? We'll talk a little bit about how to evaluate that later. So this is just a little idea about how differential privacy might be used. If you want to learn more about differential privacy, then I highly recommend you take a look at this publication that we have in draft form right now on the next slide. So it's evaluating differential privacy guarantees, and it really provides a good overview for individuals that are not necessarily very technically minded. So these is a great publication for leaders and organizations and individuals who are thinking about how they should be implementing privacy into their programs, but it's not necessarily a handbook for individuals that are going to be coding the problems. So it's a great resource for thinking about this. And I am happy to turn this over to one of my colleagues now.
Gary, before you do, I'd like to jump in with a quick question. We got a Q&A from the audience acknowledging and recognizing one of the issues that I think a lot of businesses face, which is when we think about anonymization, pseudonymization, redaction, there's no legal or regulatory standards around what, for example, anonymization really means, right? We do have, in certain contexts, HIPAA, for example, some standards that we can leverage. I know you're going to talk about evaluating sort of the technical effectiveness and technical standards around these tools, but I wanted to let you have an opportunity to weigh in on sort of the uncertainties just around the legal definitions of these terms.
Yeah, there's no definition, there's no consistent definition for anonymization. That's true. And some anonymization regulations are inadequate. HIPAA, for example, those identifiers that that one can't share, if you strip those and share the medical records, it's potentially HIPAA compliant, but it's still open to attack. This has happened in the past. That's why organizations, even though they could potentially share more records than they do with redaction, generally choose not to, because we generally recognize now that HIPAA, the protections described in there, are not actually adequate to defending against things like linkage attacks and other problems. So anonymization is a vague term, and it's probably going to stay that way, because I think we need to get away from this idea that anonymization is going to be an effective tool. As we collect more and more data, as more third-party data sources are available, then anonymization and redaction techniques are going to become less and less capable of actually protecting privacy. And it's going to leave us extremely vulnerable. So in general, I think we're going to have to rethink about anonymization as a reasonable tool at all. So I think that's to say, I think it's okay that it's a vague definition, because it's not a very effective tool in any of its many flavors.
That's a really interesting perspective. I will mention that in the context of negotiating with vendors who might either perform anonymization services or vendors who want to retain my data, my business data for secondary use, but will do so in an anonymized form. we do still try to leverage existing standards, even though they are imperfect. And Gary, to your point, even though there is no perfect solution, there is no way to fully mitigate the risk of re-identification and other linkage attacks. When we work with our vendors and when we as a business are leveraging these concepts, we still want to the best of our ability, associate them with some standard so that if, for example, we are faced with a re-identification attack that we think was, there was some vendor liability there, we're at least able to show a regulator the standards that we employed. Divya, anything to add on that before we move on?
No, I think just, I'm going to touch on this later, but I think that privacy by design and default standard, I believe it's an ISO, sort of a part of the ISO certification. That's another area where I've seen some of our clients engage in using pets and being able to align to that certification standard. So to the extent that's helpful.
Excellent. Well, let's jump into a discussion of some pet use cases, high level, and then we'll drill down into specific use cases. Next slide, please, Kathy.
Absolutely. So I just have to say it was really great to have Gary kind of set the stage, and Myriah, you did a great job. I know we've partnered before, so thanks for having me again on this webinar. I'd like to jump into some of the policy considerations and where are pets actually being used. Gary touched on it in the differential privacy context. I'm going to share a few more use cases. In particular, I think federated learning is a really interesting one, which we'll touch on a little bit later in the presentation. The UK ICO, the guidance organization for the UK, has done a great job, and their Information Commissioner's Office has kind of analyzed the costs and benefits of using federated learning. So I'd love to go into a deep dive of that a little bit later down the road, but just to give you all a sense of how common and widespread the usage of pets are, which, for those who are more maybe new to the field, you may not be aware that just like AI, which is kind of this new hype that even though it's been around for so long, it's been hyped up over the last 2 years. Same thing with pets is something, that's my belief that these techniques have been being used by the U.S. Census, I know, since 2010 and beyond. And I know Gary touched briefly on that. There are a number of public sector use cases. The U.S. CISO, the cybersecurity agency, has detailed its use of pets in very specific contexts for safeguarding against hacking and other, spoofing and other kinds of cyber crimes. The Department of Homeland Security had done a really nice job. Their CPO, their new privacy officer, came out to a conference I was at last year, and they talked about the use cases of pets in the public sector context with regard to digital identity and using pets for being able to share and process immigration data, again, highly sensitive data with regard to citizenship status and immigration. And in that particular context, I think there's going to be a growing use of pets for digital identity and that entire space, both in the public and the private sector context. But it was interesting to see Department of Homeland actually talk about it. And then finally, the Department of Transportation has also been really engaged in using pets. And these are just a few use cases that I've heard of, but there's plenty more in the public sector. And the context for the Department of Transportation was that pets can be used to leverage greater insights in real-time shipping transactions. And so I've heard of that one. And in trade, this is a very important use case. So again, pet usage varies by the pet model. And as I love the way Myriah put it, depending on pets as a family, right? And so depending on the specific individual or member of that family that's being used, the tool in the toolkit, the use case is going to vary. With regard to private sector, there's a few examples here. I love the MasterCard example. I think that's a really good one that you can definitely look at in your own time and take a better, closer look at. I'll mention a few more that are not on this slide. Google has shared at a number of conferences and has done a lot of additional open source documentation of their use cases of pets. A couple of examples: Google Trends, Google Incognito Mode, and Google Maps all involve different use cases of pets. One example is, that's really intuitive. The insights that you might gain from, peak times when you're trying to locate a restaurant, you say, okay, what's the best time to go visit the restaurant? And it says, busy, and that data that's being calculated, to talk about how busy that restaurant is in that general location, that is really utilizing the power of pets. And so without the consumers being directly identified, there is potentially some noise being injected into that data. The data is being masked and anonymized. and being shared. And so that way, these real-time insights can be generated to identify when the restaurant is most busy or the peak hours, so that, as consumers, we can really leverage that data to be able to optimize our predictions and our, decisions that we make. So that's another really good example. And then I think Gary may touch on maybe later, or maybe, at some point, reach out if he doesn't touch on it. But there are a lot of great examples of use cases of pets in the high-risk disease and clinical trials space, especially in healthcare. So that's another great example of an area where there's tons out there that, and it's been used for many decades now. Pets have been used just to be able to share that data and be able to more accurately predict best use cases of drug deployment and so on and so forth. So we talked about a couple of examples. I'll just reiterate: public sector use cases, private sector use cases, and with regard to different sectors, I know that there's the finance sector, advertising, and then some of the more consumer retail-oriented use cases in healthcare. So those are just quite a few that I think are helpful. One final thing I'll mention on this slide, and I know there's a lot that we want to cover, so I'll try to be brief. In terms of incentivizing the use of pets, this is where the public-private sector interaction comes in, and there have been a couple of great examples. One is the UK-US prize challenge. So just to give you a high-level summary, at the tail end of 2021, President Biden announced this Pets Prize Challenge in conjunction with NIST, NSF, and the UK DCMS, which is now the DCIT, or the Department for Science and Innovation Technology. And so the opportunity here was to be able to test through 3 phases what the most unique and promising new models of pets could be, and how to be able to test the boundaries of those models. Companies that participated were competing for, and it was a combination of companies and academic institutions. They were competing for a total of 1.3 million euros, or $1.6 million. So this huge UK-US prize pool. What I found really interesting was that you had these 3 phases within this challenge. It was a multi-stage competition. So there's a white paper submission, prototype development, and then finally a red teaming phase. And so I'll end on the note that there was really this red teaming phase was my favorite part of it, because not only did these pets approaches, did they get tested, and did the UK and US kind of identify which ones had the most promise, but then there was the red teaming phase where companies were then challenged to launch privacy attacks on the most promising solutions, and then really test to see which ones stood up. So I think I found that to be really reinvigorating in the fact that there was this, kind of joint effort from the UK and US to show, shared democratic values and a vision for future technologies being used in the privacy space. So those are a few examples. Next slide.
Before we jump into the specific use cases, I wanted for sort of general pet adoption and overview. Who do you see within the organizations really taking the lead on pet adoption? Is it legal and compliance? Is it going to be sort of business unit specific, right? I'm in the marketing or data science team, and I know that for this purpose, I'm going to need to evaluate pets. Is there some larger sort of stakeholder team that companies are sort of rounding up, and if a business really wants to engage with pets and understand them, sort of who internally do you recommend lead the charge?
Yeah, that's a great question, Myriah. And I think this came up last week as well. I was in London for a conference where I was speaking on a panel about pets with the UK ICO, so I'll mention that more. But this question comes up a lot. A lot of companies are looking to experiment. I think the top 3 takeaways about, who should be involved and which use case is the best use case for an organization, it's really going to depend on, I think, a few things. So the first thing is making that decision as to, are you a developer of a pet? That would, likely to entail quite a bit of resource, and infrastructure, if you're, poised for that, or are you a deployer of a pet? That means that you strictly use the pet, and MasterCard is a good example of that context where they are likely taking an open source or other type of pet and just utilizing it in the most efficient manner possible. The Google example I shared is one where they're developing their own pet and deploying it in the marketplace, and then allowing for other companies to be able to utilize that model. So as you can see, depending on the use case and depending on which kind of side you fall under unless you're under both. With regard to what sort of organizational capacity is utilized, I think it's a combination of different heads that are going to be chosen to participate in this team-wide effort. It's going to be folks like Gary, who are statisticians and who have that academic knowledge and that expertise to be able to understand the data set and inject noise where necessary, or share the data with other servers, kind of understand how to operationalize it. So it's the statisticians, the data and privacy compliance folks who can actually help develop the policies that are necessary for putting that into practice. Of course, legal is hugely important, and policy as well, because tracking the trends to see within the US and also globally what's moving, what guidance is out there, have laws changed, have definitions changed with regard to anonymization and so on and so forth. And then whoever else is necessary, like for example, marketing is a really important aspect of this, because companies really engage in a lot of the third-party marketing, which are a big part of the use cases in advertising contexts for pets. So depending on the sector too, and depending on kind of the use case, you might be more engaging more with marketing than you normally would have, just because of how you're going to be employing the tool, or the technology itself. So that's kind of a high-level overview, but there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of different folks that need to be involved, a lot of hats being worn. Awesome. All right, well, let me continue with the use cases. So that was a great question. Just thinking about kind of one of the more recent examples of where we see a lot of promise for pets. I've mentioned this before, but for those who have not heard me speak to this, over 70% of countries, oh, sorry, I'm hearing a little bit of background echo. Over 70% of countries globally have data protection regulations that limit the ability to share data and to conduct critical data analysis across borders. So one particular example of where I see a lot of promise for pets, and I'm going to speak to some changes that happened just this week that really are going to encourage the use of pets even more, is in the cross-border context with regard to international data flows. So President Biden this week, or it may have been last week, but there's documentation that's coming out, signed an executive order that signaled an important development about how the U.S. can and should be restricting the bulk data transfers of sensitive data with foreign adversaries. And that typically, there's a list of the different countries, includes countries like China, Iran, and Russia. And I think the big question mark in a lot of companies' minds is when they're engaging in these bulk data transfers, especially for some of the larger companies or for some of the smaller vendors, if they're based in China, or if they are, engaging in data flows with China and some of these other countries that are marked as adversaries, the relationship may end up changing, and there will need to be heightened standards that companies are scrutinizing their own data practices with. So I guess that's a nice segue into what can pets do in this space, especially if there are heightened restrictions and more limitations with regard to the bulk data transfers. Is there an opportunity for pets to now be this next generation tool in the toolkit? As Gary mentioned, it needs to layer on top of all of the other privacy safeguards, and it's not like a silver bullet, but how can we use pets as an opportunity to provide some promise and have an impact? And in the EO, there is some language in there that speaks to the fact that the Department of Homeland Security will be required to develop some of the additional requirements and safeguards for more secure data transfers, and that is going to be forthcoming. So it's exciting to see that. I think NIST is also going to play an important role in shaping the guidance, and they've been doing that for many years now already. But I see, and I met with Stephen Allman, ICO commissioner, last week in London, as I mentioned, and he was really bullish about the opportunities here, especially for federated learning with regard to cross-border data flows. So that one, as you mentioned on this slide, is of particular interest, and we can speak more to that particular model. But at a high level, I think the EO this week and also the EO from December of 2023 on AI, which also speaks to some of the relevance of pets, are both going to just really move this topic forward and really bring it into limelight. All right, next slide. Great. So this slide speaks to, I spoke to the EO that was just announced, this spring, maybe 2 weeks ago, roughly, And there was another EO that was put forth at the end of 2023, and that was focused primarily on AI and what sorts of guidelines and requirements in the public sector, how can government be using AI more effectively, more strategically, and what sorts of guidelines need to be developed to allow for that, as well as additional funding. In that EO that was supposed to be focused strictly on AI, and this is where we see some sort of morphing between definitions about AI and pets, that EO actually ended up covering some interesting additional impacts that the government can have on development of guidelines on pets. So in that particular guidance, the EO from 2023, December 2023, it talks about federal support for cutting edge AI, focused on both the development of new pets that have AI-based or AI-trained systems, as well as the deployment of pets in the marketplace. So that's really exciting to hear about the EO from 2023, as well as this EO from this past week or two, and the combination of two really going to move forward a lot of the agency work in this space.
On the
Awesome.
synthetic data point, I just wanted to mention, and Gary, get your insight into this, but certainly as we've started working with largely vendors, like HR tech vendors, who are auditing their models in order to demonstrate under certain city and state laws that their models don't result in sort of disparate impact or bias, we have been leveraging synthetic data. So Gary, could you talk briefly about the role of the value or the opportunity around using synthetic data to test AI models?
Yes, so synthetic data is a huge topic. It's one of the things I'm particularly interested in, and I think that it presents a lot of opportunities and a bunch of risks as well. And I think the big takeaway that I'd like people to have is that synthetic data needs to be rigorously evaluated before it's used in a variety of different ways. This is actually one of NIST's largest efforts right now. Is to look at how our tabular synthetic data, how is it made, how do different techniques comparing it, how different techniques in synthesizing data, how do they compare both in terms of privacy and utility, and there are some potential huge risks. It's no silver bullet, and there's lots of promises being made by synthetic data vendors that aren't being realized. So I'll mention it again later, but it's worth saying now, is be cautious about taking the words for, be cautious of taking the metrics that vendors are supplying along with their data. And I think one of the pieces of the puzzle that we're missing right now is there's a space for auditing synthetic data that's from a third party. So the company, council, who knows what this is going to look like, but groups that are well trained in being able to actually rigorously evaluate the synthetic data that people are releasing for both privacy and utility. Because right now, there's just not a lot of rigor in the types of synthetic data that are being sold. So that's sort of my general take.
Great, good takeaway. And actually the idea of auditing your third-party vendors who are making pet promises is something that we've seen the FTC already act on, that I know Divya will speak on later. Next slide, please. All right, another pets use case is in the ad tech ecosystem, as Divya has already mentioned. So historically, third-party cookies were leveraged by all of the players in the digital advertising ecosystem, from website operators and brands to advertisers and publishers. They were really the backbone of sort of online advertising. Third-party cookies were used and are used to track website visitors across websites, across platforms, and candidly to just target advertisements to them on the individual level. Regulators have been very clear that because third-party cookies are based on IP addresses and are oftentimes associated with larger profiles, that they constitute personally identifiable information. So there's long been pressure on these actors, being mostly the browsers, the platforms, et cetera, to move away from third-party cookies. In the United States in particular, we've seen in the last 2 years a very large uptick in litigation targeting the use of third-party cookies as being unlawful commercial surveillance, unlawful tracking under various state and federal privacy laws. And now the browsers themselves, Google in particular, have come out and said that third-party cookies do not meet user expectations, and they are not a sustainable long-term investment when we think about this like privacy-first online world that we're entering, apparently. So Firefox and Safari have already and long defaulted off third-party cookies and defaulted off other cross-site tracking. And Google has been saying for years that it will do the same in Chrome. Chrome is the largest browser by market share. About 60% of all online activity occurs on Chrome. So this transition that Google is undertaking to sort of fade out, if you will, third-party cookies is very significant and meaningful. It has a large potential impact on advertisers and publishers, especially if you are still relying on third-party cookies for your ad spend. So in lieu of the third-party cookie, platforms and ad tech participants are rolling out pets. They really see pets and other privacy-preserving interfaces that prevent individual tracking, but still have the capacity to deliver results to advertisers and publishers as the sort of solution to the phase out of third-party cookies. The biggest issue is that, you know, as a business, if we have an ad spend, we still need to know how our ads perform, right? We want to know, who are they targeting? Who are they reaching? How are those users engaging with my ads? What is my conversion rate? What is the, you know, where is there overlap in my ad spend on different platforms? And historically, the data that we were able to derive through third-party cookies would provide a lot of that insight. All right, so in the ad tech space, there's really going to be two categories of pets that we see being used. The first is those that are deployed by the platforms themselves or the operating system. So that's going to be like the Apple SCAD network, the Apple private click measurement. Some of you might be familiar with that. That is a functionality developed specifically for measuring ad clicks across websites, but it's based on differential privacy, blinded signatures, and it has other data minimization elements to it to ensure that data is protected. The Google Privacy Sandbox, Divya, I think you mentioned this previously. Google has been very transparent and has been very much a leader in sharing what they are doing in the pet space. The Privacy Sandbox is a suite of proposals that Google is considering and actually deploying in lieu of the third-party cookie. There are about 30 different proposals that Google is currently considering and evaluating them online, and you can track the sandbox, you can track those different proposals as it pertains to showing sort of relevant content and serving ads. Google's rolled out two different things. Topics API, that's essentially an interest-based advertising functionality. And then they've also rolled out their protected audience API. So that's a custom audience functionality that enables on-device auctions by browser and allows the advertiser to choose relevant ads from websites that the user has already visited. So it has some of those privacy controls already built in. And then, of course, we have the ad tech vendors themselves, Data Hub, et cetera, and they're rolling out their own sort of pet solutions, if you will. And we also see big brands announcing that they are investing in what are known as data clean rooms. So this is essentially, it allows for data sharing between different parties with limits. Unilever, Procter & Gamble have both publicly announced their data clean room initiatives. What these clean rooms at a really high level, and I'm sure Gary can provide more insight, what they do is they allow first-party data, so my own data, to be shared in a limited and controlled environment with aggregated third-party data from, for example, Facebook, Google, Twitter, et cetera. And through that, I'm able to see how the different data sets match up. So as a brand, for example, I'm able to develop or to understand whether there's inconsistencies, between the two data sets, such that I'm over-serving ads to one set, or I'm over-serving ads to the same audience. It allows me to ask certain questions of the data room. I have a privacy budget, essentially, and the answers are sort of useful analytics that allow me to understand my ad spend and where it's going. So one of the issues with data clean rooms are that they do tend to be quite expensive at this point. There's a lot of different data clean room vendors out there as well. To Gary's earlier point, we do need to evaluate the security controls and the efficacy of those data clean room vendors. But certainly that's an area that we're seeing a lot of players in the ad tech ecosystem consider. Next slide. Gary, preventing re-identification.
Brilliant. So I won't spend too long on these. I see that we're running out of time. So I'll encourage people to, I understand that these have been sent out, so it'll give you some food for thought, but I think it's good to recognize like where some major privacy failures have, where we've seen major privacy failures. So previously, I gave example of medical record relinkage. So that was one of the first examples of a linkage attack from a Mass General release of data. So LaTanya Sweeney was able to find Bill Weld, the governor of Massachusetts at the time, his medical records. Netflix Price Challenge, how surprising that if you only release a data set that only contains a person's viewing history and whether or not they liked it or didn't like it, you can relink that to real people. The third-party data set that people used in that case was the IMDb records. And so there were some conservative activists who were outed for having watched some things that didn't seem like it would be very appropriate for a person in their position to have on their Netflix playlist. So it's shocking to see how virtually all information about that's collected from people is actually personally identifiable. New York taxi cab database, this is one of my favorite examples, is that New York taxi cab, they use pseudo-anonymization to protect the cab numbers. They don't do a very good job, so it's easy to actually figure out from those pseudo-anonymized values what the real taxi cab number is. They publish all of their trips with the pseudo-anonymized data, so it means that if you take a picture of a celebrity getting into a cab, you can figure out where that person went. So again, a linkage attack based off of the photo and the taxi cab database that's poorly protected. It shows that even when we have what seems like good privacy protections, it may not actually protect us. So next slide provides some some of the major common privacy attacks are out there. There's linkage attacks. Just gave a couple examples of those. Singling out, that's another easy one to sort of understand. It's that if you have a person that has unique identifiable traits, and it's pretty easy to find them often using some other sort of record source or just looking for unique individuals. Membership inference, this is attack for on using, I'm not gonna dive into details about it. Model memorization, this is kind of a fun one. Oh, if you hit the next, you just hit it like I think 2 more times, boop and boop. Model memorization, this one has become really increasingly important with the popularities of large language models, is that they hoover up all sorts of data, including personally private data. So many early iterations of GTP instances would spit out private information if you give it a prompt to do so. Many companies have now solved this, but not all of them. And we don't know how these will be used for linkage attacks and other sorts of things. So I just want to point out that there's all these interesting ways to attack privacy, and all of them have similar consequences in that they really fuel distrust in people and data collection programs. And I think that that's a potential problem for many organizations, is that consumers don't want to share their data because it's so easy to attack privacy. And that the more, the less we're doing to protect the privacy of people, the less they're going to contribute And I think it may lead to, this place in which it's very hard to collect information. So protecting information now is going to be critical to being able to actually have useful metrics in the future. So another slide, please. Someone else.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. I know we're almost out of time. And first off, I'll just say one of the probably the most interesting things I've found is given all these risks, a lot of companies may be hesitant to engage in pets. So when we think about the cost benefit analysis I mentioned before, the UK ICO has done a great job analyzing privacy preserving federated learning. In their report, and I'll let you all as an audience, you feel free to read it in your own time, but they talk about, first off, what is federated learning? It's an approach to machine learning where you train the model data, it's separated, it's stored on a central server, and the data is then being, from each participant, the data is then being trained separately. And rather than having localized access to the data, there's a training model involved that is aggregated and assembled to construct this improved global model. So the idea here is, and I may have butchered that, but feel free to take a closer look. I think in terms of what the costs are here, there are some duplicative costs that are removed by using PPFL. That's what the UK ICO found. They said that the infrastructure costs are much lower because PPFL can remove the need to transfer the copy of the training data to a centralized database. So they were comparing it to, a more traditional model where the data is all being stored and then having to be shared and then, kind of deposited in a centralized server. The caveat here is that, of course, PPFL does require using secure CPU and other types of enclaves, which require a bigger investment in that type of cloud service support. But at the same time, the costs are recuperated when we think about the iterating models that are delivered and the data protection by design and default that the UK ICO has suggested creates long-term efficiencies. So take a closer look at the report. They do discuss some of the skills and training costs involved, which are obvious given the skills gap right now. But the bottom line was that they believe that in the guidance, differential privacy and some of these like PPFL type models can be considered anonymized and allows for better utility because it can actually reduce longer term data protection risks associated and can also allow for more data flows internationally and across borders. So PPFL is sort of one of the chosen techniques.
I'll just jump in there and say one thing else about the ICO. The ICO is a tremendous resource to organizations that are looking to evaluate the use of pets. They have an adoption guidance document essentially that is directed to data privacy officers that walks through in sort of really plain English, right? What are pets, kind of what we're doing today, but really also has some of those business consideration and other factors that an organization can leverage as they go on their pet's journey. So ICO is a great resource. And I also wanted to mention the IAB. I forgot to do this on the Cookieless slide, but the IAB is a industry group, essentially advertising industry group. They also have a working session, some policy documents, and webinars that they're doing on about a monthly basis, specifically dedicated to pets in the ad tech ecosystem. So great resources from regulators and from industry groups.
Awesome. And then I think just on this slide, we want to speak to sort of we've covered sort of the cost benefits, we've covered some use cases. What are the harms that the US FTC and other regulators are suggesting could be possible of overvaluing and misstating the nature of a company's pet usage, especially if they're considering, it deceptive. So in this case, the FTC has noted some examples of companies that were alleging that they were using specific technology-based securities or privacy guarantees. And those were, they didn't stand up to the claims they were making. And so the FTC has actually had to come after a couple of those. I don't want to name them, but some of the large platforms and others that have tried different kinds of encryption and, technology use cases. I'll say just in terms of as a close, sort of almost like a closing statement, probably two things here that can help rectify this issue. One is definitions. Take a close look, especially from a legal standpoint. The definitions are changing very quickly. The FTC just this week came out with a new definition for sensitive data, or not new classification for sensitive data, saying that browsing data is now sensitive. They're also very closely scrutinizing location data. There's been a couple of data broker cases this year with regard to enforcement action. And so we're seeing the landscape change quite a bit from sensitive data being more of those, the typical things that we think of like children's data, health data, precise location data to now more broader location data and even browsing data being scooped in there. The other thing I'll mention is just trust. I think, how can we build trust as a broader ecosystem? And that's where accountability plays a huge role. So, BBB National Programs does have a range of privacy and compliance services. And I think being able to not only do the homework, work with your legal counsel to make sure that you're checking your work in-house and, using outside counsel where necessary, but also coming to an outside agent to identify where there may be gaps and getting the appropriate certification so that you can, stand up in a court of law if necessary to provide some backing for what claims you're making. So I'll turn it back over to you, Myriah.
No, next slide, Kathy, because I think that's where we really did want to, oh, actually, Gary, quickly, how to evaluate.
Yeah, well, I think we've run out of time, so the audience will be able to look at this, but there are some questions to sort of meditate on, and all of these questions are also repeated in the ICO guidance, which I think is a very strong document. So take a look at that. But when you're trying to implement PETs, you got to ask why. What are you trying to accomplish? And think about all the consequences from that decision. ICO guidance is probably the best resource that I've seen so far. And then there are another big thing, if you go to the next slide, please, that I really want people to take away is that when implementing PETs, you've got to actually evaluate whether or not you're accomplishing what you set out to, which is, are you producing useful data? Are you producing private data? So this is going to require expert consultation. So I think hopefully there will be a ecosystem of expert groups that are doing this. Otherwise, you're going to have to find experts within your own organization and across organizations. You can always call someone like me to at least help point you in the right direction about how to evaluate these. Because oftentimes we find that when we try to evaluate things, then we have breakdowns in both utility and privacy, especially big ones. And lots of organizations are relying on providers to give the metrics for privacy and utility, and they're often providing the best case scenarios when with PETs, you should be looking probably the worst case scenarios.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I just wanted to thank you both for your excellent insight and subject matter expertise on today's webinar. We were so appreciate you sharing your time and your insight with us. I think I speak for everyone when I say that you should feel free to find us on LinkedIn or otherwise reach out and follow us, as I know Divya and Gary are relatively active in sharing resources, including resources related to PETs. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email us, and we will be circulating the PowerPoint slides after the webinar close. Thanks again for your time, and have a great day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Myriah.
Thank you.